to be sitting next to Merle Collins, who I met, I think, y'all are very young, so when I say the date, it's going to sound really scary, but it's something like 1988, I think, when I was at Oxford University. And I say this because she used to be part of a poetry group called New Dawn?
African Dawn.
African Dawn, African Dawn. And it was considered at that point one of the really hot spoken word groups. So I don't know, what happened to that, Merlin? Do you do that kind of work at any level at all?
Well, I suppose I do it at some level when I do readings or performances in various places individually. But African Dawn was disappointed in me when I went into academia.
Okay. Right, I can imagine.
Yes.
But welcome to everybody. I'm so happy that there's a nice audience here, and you all are pretty honored to have Dr. Collins here. And I say this because when you leave Howard University, these are the moments you'll remember. These are, for me, when I was here, I saw George Lamming here for the first time. I saw Sylvia Winter here for the first time. So, you know, there are names and people you meet, and that's what sticks even more, and I hate to say this in front of my colleagues, but even more than an entire class. So, right. So this is it. But I am really happy about this book for another reason. And I just had to print this recently because I saw that this whole question of honoring Malcolm's mother, the mother of Malcolm X, has become a thing. And there's a pilgrimage going to, on the history and hope of Grenada, going with Ron Daniels, going there pretty soon. And I was quite impressed that they're actually trying to go to La Digue and places like that. And I looked up La Digue because I'm like, oh, okay, this is not a world name. This is like an actual place. And La Digue means seawall embankment. And it's also a beautiful island in the Seychelles, which has another kind of really other interesting history for all kinds of reasons, linked to Ghana, where they had, Santoa in exile and so on. So beautiful islands we come from, but at the same time, a lot of histories of colonialism and so on. So I was asked to do a review of Merle's book, and I'm going to I told her when we chatted just briefly recently that I was going to kind of follow that. Maybe we can start with the title, Ocean Stirring. So tell us about the title, Merle. And when you read the book, you'll see that the leading character is called Ocean, which also has an echo of ocean. So talk a little, and I was thinking ocean as well, maybe a little bit. If you could talk a little bit about how you came with the title, which also has an extended titling, a work of fiction in tribute to Louise Langdon, Norton Little, and the fact that she's using all the names is really significant. Working mother and activist, mother of Malcolm X and 7 siblings. So that's the subtitle, quite long. Tell us about that title.
That's a very long title. Well, it's good to be here, everyone. Good to see you all. Good to be, talking in this space. And since you started off with one thing that really interested me was when you said, I see they're going to La Digue. So La Digue is not just a Merle Collins name. La Digue is a place in June. And that's interesting because what I tried to do with that text is really use the place names, the places that Malcolm's mother would have grown up. And she was born in La Digue, grew up in La Digue in that place. So it's true to history, that. But the character and the title. Ocean is the character in the novel who really sort of represents the figure that inspired her, represents Louise Little. And I decided to call her Ocean because I was thinking about Louise Little as an individual and her journey from rural La Digue back across the Atlantic into Montreal and all of that. So it seemed to me that the sea remains an important factor in the stories of African people in the Americas. So I wanted to get that idea of the ocean in the text. And Ocean, when I spoke to my my French Creole. I'm saying French Creole only because Grenada makes that distinction between Anglophone Creole and French Creole. But when I spoke to my friends, I realized, okay, it's Le Mer, the sea, but it's also Océane, the ocean. And I was told that, you know, ocean is really more, it's really more, Océane is not everyday usage, it's really more like a name. And I remember Evelyn Trudeau saying this to me, and I thought, okay, that's her name,
Wow.
Océane, because it is in fact representing all of the ocean. So that's, for me, that was the symbol of the naming, and then ocean stirrings as the title, because there's this constant turbulence of the journey, the oceanic journeys of Caribbean people. That's what I wanted to get in there, hence ocean stirrings.
Amazing. You know, when I was at Binghamton once, we had a lecture by a guy named Clement Carson, something of that sort. But anyway, he argued that Malcolm X was not fully African American because he was never in a frat nor in the black church. And I remember students got up and challenged him, because that was the thing with the Binghamton students. They got up and they said, how could you say that? And why, and so on. But then this other piece is really more critical, and that is his mother is Grenadian. And for some reason, in my own reading, and I've read, of course, like many of us, the autobiography of Malcolm X many times, but in my own reading, I kind of jumped past that. And I'm from the Caribbean. I'm from Trinidad, right next door. So how did I miss that? And I wanted you to talk a little bit about reading omissions, because I'm seeing an omission that leads you to this work that has to do with gender, how we read in terms of gender, in terms of leaving women out often, but also how we read later on in terms of getting new knowledge that then gives us more information. And then often the preference in terms of describing historical figures in terms of the father figure as opposed to the mother. So it's several things I'm asking, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what leads you to this work, and congratulations on really amazing accomplishment. What leads you to finding that space then to give her life again, if you will.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions, which make me also, you know, go back and think through the process. Because what is happening here, for me, when I first read the autobiography of Malcolm X too, a long time ago, in my you were hesitating to name years, but you know, way back there, on the time when it first came out, I don't remember seeing that mother. I don't remember focusing on the mother then, because I was looking for Malcolm's story.
Yeah.
And she appears in chapter 1, yes? That first chapter, and then we get all of his story throughout various places in the US, you know, Boston, New York, etc. So when I went back to it many years later, and I focused on that first chapter, I said, but wait now, somebody put something in here. I can't remember this. You know, so you see, it's that omission kind of thing, because I am focusing at the time on the male activist, and I am anxious to know Malcolm's story, and I'm chasing that. But when I went back to it, I suppose I was reading in a different way, and you know, sometimes we read and there are omissions. You read and you're looking for what you want at the time. And that's what I wanted at the time, the Black Power period, all of the stories of Malcolm's life. You want that. That's where I focused. When I went back later and I read this, and I contacted someone, it was actually called Red Taylor, excuse me, he was living in Montreal, he was living in Canada at the time, and he said to me, excuse me, I'm glad you found that. And he said, do you know, you should really go to Montreal, and you should also read the work of Malcolm's older brother, Wilfred. So that started off a whole thing for me, you know, trying to find out more about her. And then I realized that Eric McDuffie was doing a lot of research on her in the American Midwest, etc. And he had done considerable work, so he was really doing that research at a time when the rest of us weren't really looking at her. So that was interesting for me too, just going through all of that. But let me just say what was the part in that first chapter that got me going. Because in that first chapter, which is entitled Nightmare, Malcolm writes in the autobiography, well, it's autobiography, biography, so we're talking about that recounting. Louise Little, my mother, who was born in Grenada in the British West Indies, looked like a white woman. So, and I read that and I say, really? You pause there, and then he continues that her father was white. She had straight black hair, and her accent did not sound like a Negro's. So I'm reading this too, and I'm saying, okay, did not sound to who? Did not sound to the African-American child, her African-American child in the Michigan of the period. He's listening to other voices of quote-unquote Negroes, and that's what he's hearing, and his mother doesn't sound like them. So I'm thinking, okay, so she's sounding like a foreigner, somebody else. Did not, and then the paragraph continues. I remember hearing her say, of this white father of hers, I know nothing except her shame about it. I remember hearing her say she was glad she had never seen him. So I paused at the end of that and I said, wow, this is a whole book. This is, so that started me off on that research journey to find out who this woman is. What is this story that sounds like a story of plantation abuse, because she was glad she had never seen him, etc. So that's the paragraph in the autobiography that got me going and made me do all of that kind of research.
Amazing, but the part of it too that is fascinating is that she, and this book reveals it, was as much in the UNIA as was the father. But for some reason, when we hear the story of the father's horrible demise, we forget that the mother was also actually one of the conduits for that knowledge that Malcolm came with about Pan-Africanism and the black world and so on. So I was always fascinated too by people like Jan Carew, who had written a book called Ghosts in the Blood, in which he does talk, he tries to get Malcolm to talk a little bit more about the mother. And what you have done here as well is capture one of the comments from Alex Haley, that it was asking him a question about his mother that got him to talk, because he was trying to interview him, and Malcolm was very, subtle about not giving information, not ready to talk, and so, but then he asked him about his mother, and that's when he started to talk about himself, and it makes him sort of open up and really tell the whole story.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, that was another thing that, really fascinated me, that, in fact, in other words, he seems to be saying, well, hey, the autobiography was made possible by my asking Malcolm about his mother. I couldn't get a way into a discussion at all, and then when I eventually asked him about his mother, he started to open up, he relaxed and started to talk, because it obviously took him back to all kinds of spaces.
And she does an amazing job about capturing that part of it, particularly the tragedy, because we think of Malcolm and all that he went through, right? His incarceration and how he becomes Malcolm X. But the mother similarly is incarcerated because she is forcibly in a mental home for like 24 years.
Right, for 24 years. It's amazing.
That's probably, I don't know, we can't say it's worse, but it's equally horrible to have that experience. So tell me a little bit about, because when I was, and you jokingly commented on my own response to the fact that you organized the first part of the book with a lot of royal reading. So you spend a long time in this colonial world, and you're like, oh God, I need to get out of here. Because it's a lot of colonial schooling, the royal readers, the book, the poems you had to learn and all that. Fortunately, I went to high school in Trinidad and they used to make you learn Shakespeare like, for punishment.
Yes.
So, I mean, you could read that many ways.
Yeah.
But you learn the whole Lady Macbeth speech because of that. but Grenada Beginnings, tell us about that section of the book is organized into 5 sections. And I'm going to have her talk through a little bit of each section if you don't mind. So Grenada Beginnings is organized into 41 chapters. Begins in 1896 in Grenada. And we are with Louise and her grandparents. And the grandmother is really interesting in the text, and like all the grandmothers that appear in Black literature, really, really significant in helping to shape that little girl so that she doesn't feel any sense of loss given her past, right? So tell us about that section and why you stayed so long with the royal readers. Because it's a mix. You learn rote learning, but you're stuck with all this unnecessary colonial knowledge. At least for me.
Yes. So this is how, well, when I read the critique that you did, I thought, okay, I get the point. It's a kind of, all right, enough already point. And really, this is how you feel about the royal readers, which were a kind of tyranny, let's say, of colonial education throughout the Caribbean. And I stayed with it partly because as I went into it, well, first of all, I thought of the way Wilfred Little, Malcolm's big brother, wrote some things that suggested to me his mother was constantly feeding them through the royal reader. You know, he wrote some things and I say, so for example, when he wrote, and I think I have that somewhere, when he wrote, when he said to when Malcolm was in prison and he went to see Malcolm and he said, you know, in other words, don't let the time do you, you do the time. And telling him, sit down, pick up the dictionary and study the dictionary. You remember how Ma used to tell us, sit down with that dictionary, and she used to put the dictionary on the table there for us and I said, I know that. And then afterwards, when he also said, she would say, she would tell us, no word is too big. In the first place, don't take on these teachers who telling you you can't be something because you're Black, right? There are important Black people all over the world, etc. And she's telling them, no word is too big. When you see you get a big word in your classroom, syllabize it. And I look at that syllabized word and I say, wow, that's a royal reader word. So in fact, what that made me do was go to the royal reader and find the lessons where they're talking about syllabizing. So she was actually giving them, when she talked to them about pronunciation, she was giving back to them things that she got from the royal reader. So that fascinated me, the way that the children were saying these things that suggested their mother was kind of bringing back her royal reader training. And of course I was fascinated by the fact that she got this thoroughly colonial primary school education. And people kept saying that, sometimes I see researchers saying that she knew so much more than the father, that she was a very educated woman, etc. And I say, no, what we are talking about here is different colonial governments, and I'm putting the US in that frame too, at a particular point of the shaping, right? So that while his father in Georgia was getting, not getting much exposure to even elementary education, because Georgia was one of the worst places for education at the time, in the 19, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century.
Right.
And in fact, that actually had me reading a book about education in Georgia to understand what was happening, why it was so different for the two of them. But it's those kinds of comments from the children that made me go so much to the Royal Reader and made me go and read about education in Georgia, right? Because, you know, and I'm seeing comments like at a time when education for black people in the US generally was not a thing happening much. Georgia was particularly bad. You know, so I'm reading all of this and learning about that period myself. But and where the Royal Readers are concerned, I also researched some of the work in Grenada from the Legislative Council minutes, and saw where they were saying that some teachers didn't rejected Legislative Council attitudes, and actually they mentioned the teachers in La Digue, and you know, and I thought, wow, so she must have had a good teacher. I'm going to give her one, right? You know what I mean? So that
really did.
So
You really
comments like that.
But I don't want y'all to think it's all bleak, that early part. But you know, Merle has an amazing poem about her grandmother knowing everything. I don't know if you remember any of it.
Yeah, I think I repeated it this morning for some of them. Anyway, but it's a poem about, it's my grandmother who was born in, no, my mother was born in the same year as Malcolm's big brother, 1920. But my grandmother was born about the time of Louise Little. And she would be walking and talking. I was a little child at school, not using the Royal Reader to the same extent, because by that time teachers weren't doing the by rote thing as much, right, with the Royal Reader. But my grandmother would be repeating things from the Royal Reader. She would be saying, and I have a poem about that in which she's saying, she would be walking and talking and saying, William the Conqueror, who was the fourth son of the Duke of Normandy, he married Matilda. His children were Robert, Richard, Henry, William, and Adela. And in the poem I'm saying, Granny, mind going back, teaching what she knew, pick on the boss friend, on the boss hero, William the Conqueror. Granny didn't remember no Carib chief, no Ashanti king or queen. Her heroes were in Europe. So I was thinking about all of that as I wrote.
Brilliant.
So, you know, so some of that, I was hearing some of the voice.
But young Merle does, if you can hear the whole poem, it's just amazing. It takes you through that whole colonial experience of education, particularly the ones who knew everything about England before they got there. I remember you had the poem that really goes there. But in that early section, she brings in how the Caribbean also begins to get a taste of the Marcus Garvey and so on via Mary show, that's so. And I thought that was really significant. This is in chapter 33, which finally brings me, at least, with my Pan-African sensibility, to a place that I could connect, you know, with Garvey and Mary show as one of the chapters there. And then the uncle, her uncle, the girl's Ocean's uncle, is somebody who is very much part of it, and he's the one who migrates first, and then she has to find a way to catch up with him. But there's an amazing historical sweep here, and there's a really lovely poem that I liked. On the way to Canada, I turned to the ocean. Right. I don't know, can you read as we go along? Any of those, if you don't mind? I turned to the ocean that swallowed my ancestors. I stand on the deck. It's like a transition from that early section, taking us into the fact that she is now going to migrate to Montreal, right?
Right, going back onto the ocean. And of course, Montreal and Grenada had about the same length of period of French colonialism, about 114 years, both of them. Anyway, she's on her way to Canada. I turn to the ocean that swallowed my ancestors. I stand on deck, dare the waves to be calm. I'm here again, Atlantic. I want to visit the place that Hudson claimed. I want to walk where the Iroquois walked. I want to see more of the Lamerique that made and divided Europe. I want to listen to what the ocean says. Whisper to me, ocean. I want to find a way to tell my story. Je voulais trouver une manière pour raconter l'histoire.
Wonderful. It's lovely. I was, I was always in my other work, particularly around Claudia Jones. The question of the Atlantic always shows up. Remember, she has a long poem that is in Beyond Containment called Paean to the Atlantic, and every now and then the Atlantic shows up as a place of migration, as a conduit. I mean, we have it in the theory as well, the Benitez Row and so on, the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic. And in some places in the Caribbean, they converge, meet and converge, which is a fascinating other part of it. But what happens then, and maybe this can take us into her migration, because she migrates from the Caribbean as a young girl by herself, and she begins there, it seems to start in part 2 of the book, Letters to Ma, 1970 to 1919. And I'm wondering, do you think she's already starting to have an alter, kind of another ego, kind of place that she's communicating? Why
that's my sense.
Okay.
As I'm looking at it all. And I think it starts with Marisha, that period, as she starts to think the sort of who am I question, and to think more of this father that Malcolm says she didn't really want to talk about, etc. And I think with Marisha's teachings, because Marisha was a young man in Grenada at the time, starting to...
Maybe can you tell them who is Marisha?
Because T.A. Marisha, Theophilus Albert Marisha, as a young man, he started to oppose the colonial government and started to, speak in those terms. And Ocean, who remember represents Louise Little, started going to his meetings in Grenville and other places, where he is talking about anti-colonial, or, at least about the need to have, his term was self-government and kick out the British, basically. So in those early days, and he was one of the people who talked a lot about a Caribbean Federation. So when we talk about Caribbean Federation later on, Marisha is considered one of the fathers of that idea of a West Indian Federation, people coming together, to survive together in the period following colonial control. So she was exposed to his ideas. He started a newspaper called the West Indian. And when he started that newspaper, Ocean, I'm getting confused between Ocean and Louise here, but Ocean would be going to these meetings, listening, and then talking to her teacher, who, himself critiqued the Legislative Council. So she was beginning, before she left Grenada, to have these ideas. And when she's on the sea, I have Ocean looking at issues of race in more depth. Because, and again, I wrote this because of a story I heard from the relatives in Grenada. But she's beginning to look at issues of race in more depth, because they're looking at her and saying, you could actually be over on that side if you want to. And she's thinking, no, there's a white side. And so she's writing her grandmother all of these ideas, saying, Ma, they tell me I could go over there. But if you were here, Ma, you couldn't even come with me. Her grandmother has just died. So the death of her grandmother also, in the text, is making her think through issues of race and belonging. So it's beginning before she actually gets it.
Let's talk about that grandmother, though, because towards the way you write her departure, dying, it seems like she died and she wasn't quite gone. What were you doing?
I wanted to keep that, because that sense that she keeps having some kind of connection with the grandmother, and the idea that her grandmother's perspectives lived on in her, And I thought that the relatives I interviewed in Grenada were very ambivalent about the grandmother, you know? And so I wanted to explore some of those ideas too in the fiction. When I say we're very ambivalent about the grandmother, there's this issue of whether the grandmother and the grandfather were part of that group called Liberated Africans in the period right after slavery. As I research it, I think, no, she was actually born there. But, so all of those stories, I wanted to explore the differences between the actual experiences of those who I'm thinking of as the people from the ocean. Because to me, the ocean remains such an important thing.
It's generative.
Right, generative.
Right, I was thinking I was thinking of Sugarcane Alley. The black grandmother in a lot of our literatures across the diaspora always has that function because she's giving her Africa, she's giving her that consciousness, she's giving her that sense of self, protecting her too.
Absolutely.
And here she has this little girl who is clearly operating physically out of a category that would be considered, as you indicate, close enough to pass. But she's giving her a consciousness that does not allow her to drift. And the mother does the same thing with Malcolm. She tells him, don't think that because you're a little bit lighter that you're any better than anybody. And that's in the text.
Yes, that there. And in fact, and it's also suggested in the autobiography, because Malcolm says at one point in the autobiography that his father, he was his father's favorite child. And he says, he analyzes that his father liked him better because he was light-skinned. And he says his father, not saying that his father realized that, but he is thinking that. And he said, for the same reason, my mother gave me more help. So it was interesting to see that too, that he's looking at his mother's attitudes and saying, hey, she told me, don't think because you light skin, right? Yeah. Don't be one of these people who think. And it's fascinating to me because she was a very light-skinned woman from rural Ladigue. And so I think it's her grandmother's socialization, her grandmother keeping her straight. That made her
don't get it twisted.
Right, exactly, don't get it twisted. Yeah.
Right. So in part 3, finally she's in the U.S. And guess what? As with most Caribbeans, full-blown racism is what you encounter, right? And racism runs right through everywhere they live, their issues of economic difficulty. And it's always fascinating, and you mentioned Eric McDuffie's book, who I know pretty well. He was trying to look at the Garvey movement in the Midwest, because everybody thinks of Garvey in terms of Manhattan, Harlem, and so on, and of course Jamaica. But in the Midwest, there's another connection. From Canada to Detroit, there's a whole geography there as well. So that's what, his book is actually finished now.
Okay.
It's published. So it would be lovely if they could bring him to Howard at some point, and we should try that. But he's looking at how in that particular belt then of the Midwest, you still have that activism that the mother is involved in. And I'm amazed that you have her on some occasions where she even has a little baby, trying to find a way to go to one of the Garvey meetings and stuff like that. Yeah. So she maintains that, at least creatively, you have that.
Yeah, I have it creatively, and also because I read in one of these articles that when they were moving from one place to the other, she was essentially the person who would be there at the meetings, taking minutes, doing different things, so combining those roles of mother and activist, sometimes I'm wondering how quiet she was, etc. So that in the text, I'm also trying to explore those silences. When I don't find answers, I'm kind of thinking, well, yeah, sometimes women just don't talk, and I'm kind of trying to look through those kinds of issues.
Right, and I was also taken by the fact that it's also a Caribbean migration story, because she leaves, and she brings in a lot, Merle does, her relationship with the extended family when she's in Grenada. She even helps taking care of little kids, one named Malcolm as well. Right. And when she is by herself in Nebraska, Wisconsin, Philly, Michigan, where they end up in Lansing, Michigan. She has no help at all. She's by herself with all these children. And relatedly, and you don't pick this up in the text again, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, but it's there. She is abused. There's physical abuse. And he writes about it. He writes about it in that autobiography itself. So let's talk a little bit about what she's experiencing and how you capture that in the book.
Well, in that period, and we're talking about up to 1939, and think of when it is, we're talking about the 1920s, late 1920s, then early 1930s. This is Michigan, this is the Klan having a resurgence, coming to the house. She and Little, she and her husband are out there preaching. So, you know, there's a profile. People know them, you know, and the Klan wants to ensure that they know that they are being watched. You know, so she has that kind of thing to deal with as well, and I wanted to explore this. And then after her husband dies in strange circumstances in 1931, it's believed he's killed on the train tracks, and everyone around is saying that, hey, you know, it's a Klan that killed him, etc. So he is killed on the tracks, and then she now has 7 children.
Wow.
You know, and think of it. She has these 7 children, and when she dies, when he dies, the state at first is giving her his pension, or at least is giving her part of his pension. But then, about 7 years after he dies, she meets someone, and she's looking around and also thinking, you know, they're giving me such a hard time. They're thinking that a woman alone with 7 children, she can't take care of them. They're giving me such a hard time. And there's this man who has appeared on the scene, you know. I think he should be okay. I think he should be good. And she lets her guard down. She has a relationship with him. She becomes pregnant again.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you. There's another child.
There's another child, and her pension is stopped because the state is saying you cohabit, right? And cohabiting means you no longer deserve to have your husband's pension. And of course, before that, she was in a tizzy because trying to get jobs to take care of these 7 children. This is the Depression era. And trying to get jobs to take care of the children, when she would go to the houses of people to clean or to, you know, because she starts to do cleaning, she would get a job, and then one of the children, which suggests to me that she let them think what they want to think, so that in a sense she's passing here, right? So she would get a job, and then one of the children would come by, and they would see the child and say, oh, she's black, and she loses the job right away. You know, so things like that. So she went through a period where she is trying to decide how to survive. What do I say? What do I not say? You know, and it's clear from, you know, physical characteristics that this is a woman who, in an era when whiteness is considered, you know, the thing, well, it's probably still that era, I don't know. But anyway, where occasionally you would have that kind of ambivalence. You're wondering, what is happening here? Is she passing? You know, that kind of idea. And so you see her struggling with all of these things, and still consistently telling her children through all of this, don't let anybody make you think you're less than anybody. You know, so that fascinated me for herself as an individual.
Wow. You know, as you're talking, I can see a screenplay somewhere in there. Honestly, because just think of all the levels that we see taking place there. I'm thinking of Nella Larson's casting and all of that. So the final section, part 5, is leavings and returnings. And it's really, I was saying earlier too that you can, I know we're selling the book back there, so make sure you get a copy. But you can also listen to Merle reading it on Audible. And listening to her read the poetry is really lovely to hear. So leavings and returnings, this is where she goes into the consciousness of Louise Langdon Little and now consigned to a mental home. And one of the most powerful of the poems is They Stole My Life, page 408. They say I'm mad and they drug me. That is a dangerous thing. They could burn down your house, take your land, drag you from your house, put you in a madhouse prison. So I was quite impressed with the way that you use multiple techniques to write this work. I mean, you have the poetry that there's no other way I think one could really get into what she was feeling without that sort of poetic insight, let's say, at least for me. And then you also did the actual research, the historical research as you just described about the period. And then the linguistic, and Lisa Latouche is up there, who has worked, I know, on the Creole part of it as well, and you acknowledged her in the work, our grad student. We have to give her some recognition for that. But a lovely bonus for me is that part of it, because I had a grandmother who spoke in Trinidad, but my mother's generation was the assimilationist generation, which didn't want you to speak any of that. So my grandmother did, and she'd call you and tell you, bring this, bring that in Creole, in Patois, Trinidad and Patois, which is closer to the Grenadian one.
Yes.
But you did an amazing job of recovering a lot of that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
And recovering that, and I have to repeat again. I mentioned her earlier as well. Lisa Latouche at the back there. Hand up, Lisa. All right. Lisa, at the time that I was writing, Ocean Stirrings, Lisa was one of my students. And I said, Lisa, I've got to write this Creole voice. I really can't write it. I don't know. So, this is learning, so she worked with me, Lisa and other people worked with me on trying to recover that Creole. So throughout the text, of course, I said the first part of the text is set in 19th century Grenada, and that's that Creole voice. And like you, my mother would be speaking some of that Creole there, but she would say, if she hears me attempt to speak it, it would be like, child, stop that nonsense, right? Because they don't want you to speak it, because of course, the government has told them that this is no language. And they are concerned about their children's future. Yes, yes. So this is it. So this is part of the language thing. And also to do this, in addition to working with Lisa and a number of other people, I also did the research and to look at what they were saying in the legislative councils. And in the legislative council, they were saying things like the working people, and sending letters to the colonial office, saying that the working people speak this Creole, which is absolutely forbidden in the schools. So, and I'm looking at quotations like that, and realizing, this is why they worked against it.
And keep in mind, this is going to be happening in Africa again, in Guguationgo, decolonizing the mind, talks about that, where people were beaten if they spoke their local language. South Africa, the same thing, and so on. Yeah, so that's the part of the text that I found, for me, knowledge generating, because it brings back all those memories and so on. So the poetry, let's talk about the poetry if you don't mind, because I know we started with the fact that you're also a poet. So talk about the poems and how many of them and why and what you thought you could accomplish there as well.
But I got to that last part of when I started it off, well in fact I started off thinking, with the research I was going to be doing a digital project that was mainly going to be kind of biographical. And then the more I researched, the more I thought, hey, this is a work of fiction, this is a novel, this is a big book. And then I get to the end of it where she's in the mental home, and I couldn't write the narrative. I couldn't write a kind of flowing narrative, because this is a fractured psyche. This is the beginning. This is 1939. She's in the mental home. She wants to see her children. At first, she is kind of speaking in fairly coherent sentences, but, brief. So I couldn't get a sort of flowing paragraph or anything like that. And I eventually thought, you know what's going on here? This is first person. I have to get inside of her. I have to get that psyche thing. So it's a first person story, and it's poetry. Yeah. To present the fractured psyche, it had to be poetry for me.
Wow.
So that's really what had happened, how it ended up being poetry.
Wow.
And it had to move through various stages. Like they pick her up one morning in the 1930s and take her to this place in 1939, at the end of January 1939. And so the first part of the poetry, she's fairly coherent, because she's still thinking she wants to get back to her children, etc. And then by the 1940s, where she's realizing, hey, they're letting me out of here, the tone changes, and the flow changes. And you see her losing more of herself gradually in there. And of course, they are giving her pills, they're giving her medication, they are, complaining that she's not responsive, etc. So every time the children, and remember the children themselves are young at this point, every time the people contact the institution about her coming out, they say she's not ready, and so she's becoming more and more angry, and of course disconnected from reality because of the medication. And recently, when I had access to some of the things that were actually happening in the hospital, you're realizing that a lot of this was like this in truth. She started actually kicking and biting, because then of course, that was my response. I thought, of course, So she started actually reacting in these ways, and then they're saying, you see, she's crazy,
Yeah, I was taken too by the fact that the kids come to see her at one point, but now they've grown, and she's like, these are not my children. That was fast, and one of them probably could have been Malcolm, because he does write about going to see her.
He writes about going to see her at 54.
So she's seeing adult men, but she's like, what happened in that long period in between? That now, these people are saying they're my children, but these are not my children.
Right.
So
I was kind of thinking,
yeah,
is the child inside there?
Yeah.
Who is this big man? Is this man my son?
Yeah.
Where's my child? Is my child inside of there? Why am I here? Sing a song to me. And we have to think not only of the physical circumstances, but also what is happening in her head and the kinds of journeys, psychological journeys she is making too. Something is happening to me. I need to feed my little baby. They took me from my children, they imprisoned me. A kidnapping, a savage pulling off my shoes, a getaway vehicle, a driver speeding, pounding, shouting, stares, screams. I keep dreaming this bad dream. Why am I here? Sing, bird, sing a song to me. One there is who cares for thee. Day by day, his strong right arm keeps both thee and me from harm. And how I'm conceptualizing this, that first poem, it's what she's saying, the questions, why am I here? But it is also her memory of poems that she had done in school, and poems that at the time, food and plenty frustration, war, money, officials that thieving, things bad, and I needed support and time to catch myself. But I wasn't mad. That is what my children saying they know. They stole my life. The clan, the judge, the children keep asking, they tell me, for them to release me, but they say I'm mad. Year after year after year, they saying I'm mad. the judge that commit me, my children thinking, was the same judge that worked on the case to take the land. He and his people, they commit me to madhouse. They stole my life. Whether they're in clan costume or out of clan costume, the same people, the same people, I will stay quiet so I can get out of here, because it's still not me in charge. But they stole my life. Volé, teeth. They took my life.
By being in your presence, I can't imagine that one person who has done so much could have been on this earth for such a little period of time. And I'm going to allow the audience to do some questions and answers. But I have one question I want to ask, which is, how much time it took to put this together? It's amazing.
You know, that's a big question. It's a few years of research, because, you know, as I look back into my emails and correspondence with various people over the time, because as I said, I went to Montreal, I went to Grenada, I talked to various branches of the family, had different kinds of responses, so it took a few years.
Yeah.
Went to hear him read his poetry, and there he is reading Evening, Miss Evie, Miss Maisie.
Come on.
And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, hold on here, you could write poetry. And that in a sense got me into a different kind of, you know, into the Caribbean voice, and then later on I heard the voices of African literature, because at the time they were just starting an African literature course that, you know, that I took as well there. And so I was introduced to a whole different kind of voice, and made my, you know, made my own decisions where poetry was concerned, so that when I came to write, I found that I was having a different kind of ethos.
And for a long time. As I do some work with well, sugarcane workers actually, and the Afro-Haitian population in the Dominican Republic, and I'm in the midst of pretending to doing some writing on that. Wow. I wonder how many years I have ahead of me before I can get that work finished. but I'm truly inspired, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone here for being with us today and inspiring us to, if we can be half as successful as you have been in what you do, I think we would all be making a great contribution. So I thank you.
Thank you.